Church, if you are new, we're glad that you chose to worship with us. I also would like to welcome my mom, who's here, who is worshiping with. She. I didn't know she would stand up, right? But it's like good to see you. So my mom, let me tell you something real quick. My mom doesn't think I'm a real pastor because I don't wear a suit and a tie. And so every time she sees me preach, she's like, I don't think you're a real pastor. And so I'm not. I don't think I am. But today, if you're visiting for the first time, we are in Genesis chapter 31. And we've been walking through the book of Genesis for pretty much since the beginning of the year. And so today we're in chapter 31, and I've entitled this message, Divine Transition, when God says you can't stay. Divine transition. Most of us have a smoke alarm in our home. And there are times when that smoke alarm will go off and make a sound. And when that smoke alarm makes a sound, it's usually to alert us that something is wrong or something needs to be addressed. And sometimes whatever it is that needs to be addressed is probably a very simple fix. Probably you just need to change the battery, right? And so when the smoke alarm goes off and makes that sound that you probably just need to change the battery, usually that sound is very annoying, right? It's a very annoying sound. In fact, it's designed to be a sound that is impossible to ignore, right? So it's this constant, steady beep that you hear almost every 30 seconds, right? Beep, 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 right? This steady, constant, annoying noise that you hear every 30 seconds is meant to warn you that the system intended to protect you from a hidden danger is failing. And you need to do something to address it before something destructive happens. But then what do we do when we actually hear that sound? When we hear that sound going off? Sometimes we don't respond to it the way we should, right? Sometimes when we hear that sound, we're too busy and we allow days to go by before we address it. And then as days go by, what eventually happens is you start getting adjusted to it, right? That noise that is intended to be annoying, you learn how to drown it out. You learn to live with it. You learn to even sleep through it, because some of us can even sleep through it, right? And then what's worse, some of us even disconnect that alarm. We take the broom, we just knock it down, or we just even disconnect the entire alarm. And so instead of fixing what's wrong, we disconnect from the alarm, which leaves us completely vulnerable. And we do everything but to address the actual problem. Every single one of us has an internal smoke alarm, an internal spiritual tension we feel when God is trying to get our attention, right? When we are settling in a place where we are not meant to stay. And so it's this constant, agonizing restlessness in our spirit that shows up when we are settling in a job, in a relationship, an environment, and something in us knows that this is not it. The internal wrestle you're feeling may be a signal that you are about to go through a major transition. A major transition where God is about to redirect your life, to move you out from where you are and realign you to where you need to be, to walk in His calling and purpose. And this is what Genesis chapter 31 is about. Jacob is about to experience a divine redirection. And so for context, Jacob has been running away for almost all of his life. Ever since Jacob stole his brother's blessing, right? Jacob has been running for his life. He's been running from a brother who wanted to kill him, right? In Genesis 29, Jacob runs away to hide in his uncle's house, Uncle Laban's house. And then by the time we get to Genesis chapter 31, we find out that Jacob has been hiding there for about 20 years. 20 years, Jacob has been running away and hiding. And so for 20 years, Jacob has settled there. He settled there, he built a life, he built a large family, he even became very successful. But the entire time, he was not in alignment with his calling. He was settling somewhere he wasn't meant to stay. This was only meant to be a temporary refuge. In the background, the signals were going off. And now those signals are getting louder and becoming impossible to ignore. So in 31, we're going to see how God sometimes will disrupt. I want you to listen. God will sometimes disrupt and disturb your comfort to make you uncomfortable in places that you're not meant to stay. To move you, to move us to a place where we are walking in our calling and our purpose. And so we're going to see 4 phases of transition, 4 phases that we will experience when God is moving us from where we are to the place where we need to be. Phase 1, the internal signal. The internal signal. And this is when the alarm is going off. This is when God is stirring something in you. This is when God is stirring up a tension, maybe a passion or a desire or even discontentment or frustration or a conviction that makes you restless, that you can't sleep, you can't shake it off. In Genesis chapter 31, we see the word now. The word now means there is a shift that is happening. It's a shift in the story. It's a shift in direction. What was happening in the past is now about to change, now. And then in these 3 verses, verses 1 to 3, there are 3 signals that Jacob senses that begins to confirm in him that the Spirit of God is shifting him. Verse 1, it says now. Now Jacob heard. Jacob heard what Laban's sons were saying. Jacob had taken all that was our father's and has built this wealth from what belonged to our father. Verse 2, now Jacob saw from Laban's face that his attitude towards him was not the same as before. In verse 3, now the Lord said to him, go back to the land of your ancestors, to your family, and I will be with you. Jacob heard, Jacob saw, and the Lord said. And these 3 signals all came together to wake Jacob up. Jacob heard. He heard. He hears the gossip. He hears the slander. Jacob overheard Laban's sons whispering about him that he stole their father's wealth and he built his success from what belonged to their father, Laban. But the irony is, if you go back to Genesis chapter 30, verse 27, it's completely clear that Jacob was the reason their father's business was blessed. Right? In Genesis chapter 30, verse 27, Laban even said to Jacob, if I have found favor with you, stay. I've learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Then Laban said, man, name your wages and I will pay you. And so Laban even admitted that the business was successful because Jacob was running it. Because Jacob was the one who was out in the field during the heat, in the cold, sleepless night, shepherding Laban's flock. But still, the sons were envious. The reason why the sons were envious of Jacob's success was because Jacob's success had exposed something. Jacob's success had exposed where the sons were stagnant. Where the sons were stagnant. Because sometimes, listen, your personal growth or your professional growth, your professional success will not always be celebrated by others. Right? Unfortunately, your professional growth or your professional success, your personal growth, may cause tension, may expose insecurities or jealousy or resistance in those around you, especially to those who stop growing. While Jacob was growing and building and prospering, others around him stayed the same. So it's like if you went back to your high school reunion and then everyone is sharing about their success, and the people who stayed the same look at you and be like, oh, you're just showing off, right? Jacob's success was exposing in those sons areas in their life where they stopped growing. And the blessing that brought favor to Laban's field eventually became the very thing that the son began to resent. And so not everyone will celebrate what God is doing in your life, because not everyone is part of your assignment and your journey. Sometimes we are trying to shrink ourselves to make other people comfortable. And sometimes we try to downplay what God is developing in us just to reduce the tension around us. But listen, don't hide what God is doing in your life just to keep certain relationships and the environments around you the same. Don't shrink yourself. Because the truth is, when you are growing, it will create tension and it will create change. When God is expanding you, not everyone and everything around you will grow with you. Right? Your change will not always be welcome and accepted by others. But that doesn't mean that you stop growing. It just means that you have to stay faithful to what God is doing, even if people don't understand or they become resistant. 2, Jacob sees a shift. Jacob sees a shift in Laban. Laban's face, body language, and attitude towards him completely changed, right? It's like when you walk in the room, maybe at work, you walk into the break room and everyone stops talking. And you're like, that's kind of weird, right? His attitude and body language change, right? So it's not just criticism anymore, but now the look that Laban gives him is different. The way they spoke to each other feels off, and there's tension. The pressure between Laban and Jacob is now becoming unavoidable. What used to be a quiet tension is now becoming an environment where Jacob could no longer stay, because it was no longer stable and it was shifting. The third signal is the spiritual conviction, where God actually speaks to Jacob now and says to Jacob, go back home and I will be with you. And so now God tells Jacob, it's time to move, it's time to return back to your calling and purpose. And so God's word was the ultimate confirmation for Jacob to move. And so what felt like a disruption in relationship or in an environment was actually a redirection, right? And so don't misread the disruptions in your life, because sometimes our relationships, right, or our jobs or the different areas in our lives can feel like things are falling apart, when in reality what God is doing, he's shifting those things in its proper places. So don't misread or don't misunderstand the disruptions in your life. Don't ignore or resist the tension. Pause and ask, is this frustration or is this God's redirection? Right? But the question many of us may ask is, how do I know? How do I know if this is a divine redirection or I'm just having a bad day at work, right? How do I know if this is a divine redirection or this is just a hard season, a hard relationship? How do I know when God is actually shifting things? And the answer is clarity. Clarity that comes from a spiritual conviction, right? Jacob didn't move because he was uncomfortable. Jacob moved because God made it clear. God made it clear. God said to Jacob, get up, go, and I will be with you. And so God spoke in a way that confirmed that the tension that was stirring in Jacob wasn't random, it was directional. It was directional. And so listen, what I want you to know is don't confuse every uncomfortable season, every hard season as a divine excuse to exit, right? Don't confuse every uncomfortable season as a divine excuse to exit. And so just because you are having a difficult season somewhere in your life doesn't automatically mean that God is calling you to move or to leave. Sometimes you're meant to stay. Sometimes you're meant to endure. Sometimes you're meant to build. God is using those hard seasons to build resilience right where you are. However, when that clarity finally hits and you receive that clear internal conviction that a season is over, that disruption is actually redirection. And that doesn't always mean you will have all the details. It means you have enough details to take the next step. Now in verses 4 through 16, after Jacob hears from God and he received clarity, he goes to his family and talk about it. And he's talking to his family, and then he starts looking back and realizing and recognizing the signals have been going off all along, right? He begins to connect the dots, how Laban kept changing his wages, how the environment underneath him kept shifting, and how God had been sustaining him through it all. Jacob starts receiving clarity. In verse 5, look at what Jacob says. He says, I can see from your father's face, talking to Rachel, I can see from your father's face that his attitude towards me is not the same as before. But the God of my father has been with me. Right? Jacob now sees with new eyes, fresh perspective, to see when Laban's attitude was shifting against him. The God of my father has always been with me. A perspective he probably didn't see before. Verse 6 and 7, he says, you know that with all of my strength I have served your father, and that he has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times, but God has not let him harm me. Right? He says 10 times. 10 times Laban manipulated the system. 10 times Laban adjusted the agreement with Jacob, shifted the wages. 10 different times he tried to contain, control, and limit Jacob. But the entire time, Jacob says, God did not let him harm me. And I hope you can see. I hope you can see and open your eyes to see God's faithfulness in the tensions that you are. That while people have shifted against you, while people have tried to harm you, and while people try to manipulate you, manipulate situations around you to contain you and control you or to limit you, open your eyes to see God has constantly been holding you, right? Stop focusing on the 10 times things have changed. Stop focusing on the ways that people have tried to harm you, but begin to pay attention to the God who have never let any of those 10 things harm you. When God's hand is on your life, no one can touch you. When God's hand is on your life, no one can touch you. Every scheme that's meant to harm you has to pass through his permission. Right? Phase 2, the disruption. This is when that noise wakes you up in the morning and you got to do something. Right? When God starts shifting your life and starts disturbing your peace. Right? In verse 13, God says to Jacob, I am the God of Bethel, where you poured oil on the stone markers and made a solemn vow to me. Get up, leave this land, and return to your native land. And so Jacob gets up. He gets the green light. He gets this divine directive to leave. And he's given God's assurance. God says, I will be with you. I am the God of Bethel, where you poured oil on the stone marker and made a solemn vow to me. And so for context, right, God is reminding Jacob of who he is. And so this is God giving Jacob his divine resume. This is who I am, the God of Bethel. He's reminding Jacob of chapter 28. And this is when Jacob first encountered God. And he encountered God when Jacob was in his lowest moment, when Jacob was at rest. And God gave Jacob a vision, and this vision was of a ladder. And this ladder signified God is the one who is working for him and doing for him. And so God promised to Jacob, I will give you stability, I'll give you protection, I'll give you provision. I got you. Rest in me. I am that God that you met at Bethel. And so God is saying to Jacob, I've covered you before, and I'm going to cover you now. But then even with this promise from God, that doesn't mean Jacob doesn't have fear. God tells Jacob to return back to his native land, right? Jacob has been running away from home, and now God is telling him to go back home. Jacob has to return home and probably has to face his brother, who still probably wanted to kill him. It's been 20 years since he's seen his brother. Who knows what's waiting for him on the other side? And when God calls you to get up and move, that is a call of faith. It's a call of obedience. However, when you are walking in faith, when you are called to have faith, that doesn't mean you won't have fear. Right? Faith doesn't mean you don't have fear, but faith means you are obeying God even in the middle of your fears. Right? Obedience will require you to move without knowing what's waiting for you on the other side. And so whenever God calls you to obey, he's not going to give you all the details. God's not going to give you all the details. You know why he doesn't give you all the details? It's because he wants you to rest in the God of Bethel, to rest in him and have complete confidence in him, right? And you should be encouraged right now to know that if God has spoken and God has given you clarity, if you have heard from God, then God has already gone ahead of you. God has already accounted for what you will face and has already committed himself to be with you in it. Right? So you're not stepping in the unknown alone. You are not stepping in the unknown alone. God is already ahead of you to guide you and to provide for you. However, in verse 14 to 20, Jacob does something that most of us would do. He allows fear to control his decision making. Even after hearing clarity, even after getting clarity and hearing clearly from God, even after receiving this divine directive to get up and go, there's still a human wrestling with fear and faith, right? The wrestling between fear and faith. Look at the wrestle in verses 14 through 21. Jacob wrestles with the fear of financial loss. Rachel and Leah are complaining that we don't have money, Jacob. We don't have money. Laban cheated us, cheated them of all of their money and left them with nothing. Look at verse 17 to 20. Jacob wrestles with confrontation. And so he packs up his entire family and he just leaves in the middle of the night. He leaves in secret because he doesn't want to have to deal with Laban. So it's like if you were at a job and you wanted to quit and you didn't want to have to put in your 2 weeks notice or speak to your boss, you wait until it's lunch and you just walk out. He was afraid to have this confrontation. Look at verse 19 to 21. Jacob wrestles with Laban's control and manipulation. He runs without Laban knowing because Jacob is afraid Laban will regain control over the situation. Jacob knows that the longer he stays, the more he could be manipulated by Laban. Jacob had a history of being manipulated by Laban. Laban made Jacob work 7 years for Rachel, right? He sees Rachel, falls in love with Rachel, and then he says, I'm going to work for her for 7 years. Laban says, okay, fine. Work 7 years. Wedding day happens. Jacob goes to consummate his marriage. He wakes up in the morning. A switch happens. Laban gives Jacob Leah instead. How does that happen? I don't know, right? You wake up in the morning, you realize, oh, I'm with the wrong person, right? Jacob wakes up and he realized Laban switched Rachel for Leah. He comes to Laban and says, yo, what did you do to me? And then Laban said, I forgot to tell you. It's not our custom to give the younger first. You have to marry the older. I have to give the older. Technically, it's not a lie, but it was manipulation. All right? And so Jacob says, you know what? I'm going to work another 7 years for Rachel. So now he's working 14 years for Laban. And then another 6 years he works under. So for 20 years he's been under Laban's control. And so Jacob was afraid of being pulled back in again. And so Jacob's fear is literally a trauma response. Yes, he's moving in obedience, but there's still hurt and there's past trauma that's influencing how he moves forward. So even when God has clearly spoken, there's times where we can have anxiety still, affecting how we take our next step. Even when we know God is telling us to move, fear can try to dictate how we obey. Thoughts of lack of provision, thoughts of having to confront hard conversation, thoughts of retaliation, losing stability can all cause us to wrestle with faith. And this is where it can become very uncomfortable. You're following God, but you're still learning to silence the fear, right? But what's encouraging for you to know is your obedience does not have to be perfect for God to be faithful. Your obedience does not have to be perfect for God to be faithful. Even when Jacob is panicking and he's moving in fear, God's promise to protect him doesn't change. God stays committed even when Jacob is still learning how to trust fully in God. Jacob is learning how to fully trust in God in the process. Your obedience does not have to be perfect. Phase number 3. This is the instruction. This is when you hear the instruction and you decide to respond. Do I obey or do I ignore? Do I drown it out? Jacob responds to the instruction. He responds. As Jacob responds to the instruction and leaves, the very thing that he fears begins to happen. Laban finds out. Laban finds out that Jacob is leaving. In verse 22, it says that for 3 days, Laban found out and he had gone. And so he took some of his relative along and chased after Jacob for 7 days. for 7 days, right? And sometimes we think if we obey God, if we follow God's instructions, our obedience will free us from oppositions. Sometimes we think if we obey God, God will eliminate our oppositions. God will silence our doubt. God will remove those obstacles. But the reality is, following God's instruction doesn't mean that He will remove those things and that we will not have conflict. Following God doesn't mean that He will eliminate our opposition. We won't have oppositions in our journey and that our journey will be easy. It doesn't mean that our tensions will be over. Listen, you might obey God and quit your job, but it doesn't guarantee that you're going to have a job right away. You might end a relationship out of obedience, and you might find yourself single for a very long time. Or you might step out in faith and start a new business, and doesn't mean that it will take off right away, and that business will pick up right away and grow. Obedience does not mean and does not guarantee that things will be easy. But what obedience does, obedience positions you under God's guidance and protection. That's what obedience does. Look at verse 22. It says, on the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. So Laban took his relatives with him and pursued Jacob for 7 days and overtook him in the hill country of Gilead. But God appeared to Laban in a dream that night and warned him, don't say a word to Jacob. Don't say a word to Jacob. Don't make a threat or a promise. God intervenes for Jacob before Laban could even attack. The night before Laban caught up with Jacob, God appears to Laban in a dream and warns him, don't say a word to Jacob. Don't make a threat. Don't make a promise. And so God places this wall of protection around Jacob before Jacob even knew or realized that there was a threat behind him. A threat was working behind him, but God was already handling it. And this is the protection of God. He places boundaries and limits around you that nothing could harm you unless God gives it authority to. Right? God has already gone ahead of you to take care of those problems that you will encounter. Listen, God had already worked out those moments before it even arrived. Before the conversation happened, God already worked things out to give you favor. Before the provision was needed, God already supplied your needs. Before the door even opened, God had already positioned you for that opportunity. Before the outcome was decided on, God had already positioned you before you stepped into it. God was already in it. When God is leading you, He doesn't just direct you, He goes ahead of you to provide you protection and guidance. Now in verse 26, Laban finally catches up to Jacob, and now Laban tries to rewrite the narrative. He tries to rewrite the narrative and play the victim. And he tries to gaslight Jacob by acting like he has the real power to hurt him. Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You've deceived me and taken my daughters away like prisoners of war. Why did you secretly flee from me and deceive me and not tell me? I would have sent you away with joy and singing and tambourines and lyres, but you didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters. You have acted foolishly. I could do you great harm." But last night, the God of your father said to me, watch yourself. Watch yourself. Don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Laban tries to play the wounded victim and said to Jacob, "You hurt me. Why didn't you let me give a proper send-off to my daughters and celebrate you and kiss my daughters and my grandchildren. You rob me of the opportunity of looking like a loving father. But this is not really about celebration. This was manipulation. The guy who changed Jacob's wages 10 times. The God who sold their children inheritance. The God who enslaved Jacob and manipulated him and changed his contract now is pretending to be a loving grandfather who wants to throw a going away party for Jacob. And so Laban tries to gaslight Jacob to make him think that he can harm him. But the reality is, his hands were tied. His hands were tied. So instead, he tries to play mind games with Jacob. Mind games to rewrite the narrative to maintain control. So here's the question. How do you silence those Laban voices in your mind? How do you stop those external criticism that you are hearing, or maybe those internal voices, or the imposter syndrome that causes us to second guess our identity, our calling, and doubt God's direction? How do you silence those Laban voices that makes you think or say to yourself, am I really cut out for this? Am I really cut out for this? Do I really have what it takes? Is this God or is this my own ambition? We often replay things in our mind that people have said about us, that we are not qualified or that we are not good enough for something. How do we quiet those imposter syndrome that tries to have us think that we are just foolish and deceiving ourselves, that you are a fraud, you're acting foolishly, God really did not call you for this? How do we quiet those internal voices that tries to reframe our narrative, that we're not qualified to walk in this new season that God is calling us to step into? But here's the thing about God's calling. God does not call those who are already qualified. God does not call those who are already qualified. God is the one who qualified those who he calls. God is the one who qualified those he calls. Our confidence isn't supposed to come from our own abilities, but it comes from God's calling and his presence with us. Jacob is not acting foolishly. He's acting in obedience. And when you are acting in obedience, don't let Laban's voice cause you to doubt. Because Laban's voice does not have real power, right? Laban gives this false threat to Jacob. I could do you great harm. But that was a lie. That was a lie meant to have Jacob second-guessing his true freedom, right? Laban was no longer the real threat. The external opposition wasn't the greatest danger anymore. But look at verse 30 and 35, and you're going to see what was the greatest threat. Sometimes the most dangerous threat isn't what's around you, the criticism that you are getting from people. Sometimes the most dangerous threat is what you are still carrying inside of you. All right? Because you can leave a place in obedience and still bring hidden baggages with you into your next season. Hidden attachment that can derail God's plans. In verse 30 and 35, we see something happening in this transition that could have major problems. In verse 30, Laban confronts Jacob about stolen household idols, right? If we look back in verse 19, Rachel stole her father's idols, and Jacob didn't even know it. It says, so Laban went into Jacob's tent, Leah's tent, the tents of the two concubines, but he found nothing. And when he left Leah's tent, he went into Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken Laban's household idols, put them in a bag, a saddle bag of the camel, and sat on them. Laban searched the whole tent, but found nothing. And she said to her father, Father, don't be mad at me. My Lord, I can't stand up in your presence. I'm having my period. She lies to her father. She lies. She stole the household idols and lied and deceived her father. She learned from the best, right? She was sitting on an idol, but said she couldn't get up. Those idols were Rachel's hidden attachment she was sitting on. There were items that she could fall back on. There were items that brought her security and comfort. This was the family heirlooms. And this was kind of like the family deeds that she could take, because these things were valuable, that she could take and probably pawn or sell or know had value just in case of emergency, right? When you are transitioning or God is calling you to a new direction, you can't hold on to old sources of comfort and security anymore, right? You have to make a clean break. You have to let go of things that you would be tempted to lean on that will compromise your dependency on God. Those are your safety nets. Those are your backup plans. Whenever you're transitioning, listen, we crave to have backup plans. We crave to have a plan B, right? Those hidden attachment that could derail what God is doing. Your safety nets. You know, when my wife and I, we moved to D.C. back in 2018 for her to go to dental school, I was with the kids at home for almost 3 months. At the time, I believe God was opening the door for me to go into full-time ministry. And so we moved to D.C., and I did not have anything planned. I was trusting in the Lord. But then I realized I was playing, daddy daycare, right, for 3 months. And nothing came up. No opportunities for ministry. And I'm sitting here going crazy. Finances are piling up. I'm feeling like I don't have a purpose. And then I think to myself, you know what? I have a degree. For 10 years, I work as an optician. And for 10 years, I have experience. I can easily go and apply for a job. And I did. I applied for a job. I sent out my resume, and I was going and doing some interviews. And something in me didn't feel easy about it, because I really believed that the Lord would open an opportunity for ministry. And then I remember having a conversation with my wife, and she said, Carly, if you really believe that the Lord is opening a door for you to do ministry, just trust Him. Just trust Him. And she was right. I was leaning on my backup plan. I was leaning on the fact that I knew I had a degree and I could always go and find another job, but I wasn't fully releasing myself to God. Rachel, listen, was sitting on her backup plan. She was sitting on this idol, which is a picture of how we try to hide our lack of faith, right? We say we're trusting God to step into a new season, but we're still sitting on a backup plan, trying to hide them so that we try to hide our backup plan so that we can just not fully trust in what God is doing. And so what are some hidden attachment? What are some baggages that you're holding on to that could be compromising your obedience to God? What are some things maybe God is asking you to fully release? What is that backup plan that you're holding on to just in case the next season fail? Listen, what toxic relationship and connection are you holding on to instead of completely cutting off? What door are you stepping out of, but you're still keeping one foot in? Jacob was moving forward, responding in divine call. But then listen, he didn't even realize that there was still a spiritual compromise in his camp, which leads us to another danger. You may not even know who or what you're connected to. You're moving forward, but you may not be aligned with the right people. And so you have to know who you are aligned with. And so the question is, who are you connected with? And as you move forward, the people in your inner circle, people that you are connected to, might be carrying hidden baggages or hidden fears or a hidden attachment that you don't know, and those things can derail the trajectory of your calling, right? Sometimes it's not just what you are carrying that will hinder you, but it's what you're connected to, what you are aligned to, because alignment matters. And as God moves you forward, He's not just connecting you with His calling, but He's also concerned with how you are aligned. He's not just concerned about your direction, He's also concerned with what and who is coming with you. Phase 4, the separation. This is when, stepping into the next season, you have to learn how to close the chapter. You have to learn how to close the chapter that you've outgrown. In verse 36, Jacob now finally finds his voice and he confronts Laban. And after 20 years of being cheated, manipulated, taken advantage of, falsely accused, and even pursued with harmful intent, now comes the confrontation. But notice, Jacob doesn't explode with emotion. He responds with clarity. He brings the receipt. But the receipt was not of what Laban had done, but it was clarity on what God has done. Verse 36 and 42, Jacob begins to recount all of what he went through during his time with Laban. How he served faithfully for 20 years in verse 38. How he shepherded Laban's flock with care and integrity, verse 39. How he endured heat by day and cold by night, verse 40. Even though he served faithfully, Laban still cheated him and changed his wages again and again, verse 41. But then in verse 42, listen to what Jacob says. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, had not been with me, certainly now you would have sent me off empty-handed. But God has seen my affliction and my work, and He issued this verdict last night. And so what Jacob is saying is, I served faithfully, but I didn't serve Laban, I served God, right? I shepherded faithfully. I didn't shepherd Laban's flock, I shepherded God's flock. I endured because God gave me strength. And even though you cheated me, God was still with me. When we now see, what we are now seeing is growth and maturity in Laban. Growth and maturity framing what he went through. And so he's not giving a defense right now of what he went through. He's giving a declaration. He's giving a testimony of God's faithfulness, right? And this is how you know when you have outgrown a painful season. You shift your perspective and stop recounting the trauma of what people did to you, and you start declaring and testifying about the provision of what God did and brought you through. Right? You stop recounting your traumas, but you start testifying. Yes, it was unjust what Jacob went through. Yes, he was manipulated. Yes, he was taken advantage of, but God was still with him. God protected him, he says. God protected me when you tried to harm me. God provided for me when you tried to cheat me. God gave me success when you tried to limit me. Jacob completely flips the narrative and acknowledged the reality that though the season was painful, God was still faithful. God was completely faithful, covering him. He saw God's hands working in his favor even when things were working against him. Every weapon was working against Jacob, but none prospered. When you outgrow a painful season, you can look back and tell your story, not through the lens of what people did to you, but through the lens of what God did for you. Finally, in verses 43 through 55, the end, Jacob and Laban makes a covenant with each other. So instead of continuing in this conflict, they establish boundaries. But notice Laban is still trying to control Jacob and control the circumstance. He tells Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the children, my children, and the flock, my flock. Everything you see is mine. But what can I do today for these daughters of mine or the children they have borne me? Even though Laban is still trying to manipulate Jacob again, saying he owns everything, Jacob has outgrown the system Laban was operating under. He stops fighting with Laban. He lets go of his ego and just set boundaries. Maturity is when we understand not every battle is ours to win. And every situation is not ours to fight. And so maturity is when you leave things in God's hands. Jacob cuts off this relationship with Laban. He doesn't need Laban's approval anymore. He doesn't even need Laban's apology anymore. He stops explaining himself and stops forcing Laban to see reality. And so Jacob makes a covenant with Laban. He forfeits his need for justice. He leaves the fight in God's hands so he can fully step into his next season unburdened. So as we close, I want to give you 5 things to remember. 1, remember, not every tension is a sign to run, right? And so some are signs for you to remain and be obedient where God has you, when God placed you, until it's clear for you to move. Don't confuse discomfort with direction, right? God can sustain you where you are in hard places, just like he did with Jacob, even in those places where it feels uncomfortable, even in those places where you're still trying to figure things out. Don't confuse the tension as a sign to run. 2, obedience won't remove opposition. Even when Jacob obeys God and leaves, Laban still pursues him. And so don't be surprised when following God comes with pressure, or people just don't understand, or there's resistance. Obedience doesn't mean things will be easy, but God will protect you and guide you. 3, what are you carrying with you in your transition? And so just like Rachel, we can still be holding on to hidden attachments and backup plans and things that we just don't want to let go of, just in case. Be careful not to go into your new seasons with hidden attachments. 4, don't give in to the voices of Laban's. Don't give in to the voice of Laban's. The imposter syndrome, those internal accusations are real. Sometimes the loudest Laban's are not the criticisms that you're receiving from people. Sometimes you are. You are your Laban, constantly questioning your worth or constantly replaying your failures, trying to rewrite your identity, the story of who you are. But when God calls you, listen, he will qualify you for what he calls you to. And then 5, nothing has authority over you unless God allows it. God is already ahead of you in your transition. He puts boundaries on what can touch you. He is handling those things that you don't even see coming. And so when God is calling you to a transition, he's not just leading you out of something, but he is leading you into something better. And so what are those internal signals that you are sensing right now? What are some things that God is doing in you right now that he is trying to move in your life? Your tension right now may not be to leave a job. The tension that you are feeling right now may not be to leave a relationship. The tension right now that some of you might be feeling is to leave an old life. Maybe right now God has been stirring in you to leave behind, to get up and leave behind an old life. That he's been calling you to walk and to follow in your purpose, which is to walk and follow Jesus. Amen. And you've been feeling that signal for a very long time, and you've been drowning it out. You've been doing everything to ignore that signal. And you've been sleeping through that signal. And now that signal is getting louder and probably becoming impossible to ignore. You have a decision to make right now to respond to it or ignore it. But responding to it will one day save your life. Ignoring it, one day you will have to deal with the fire that burns out everything. And so God is calling you, and there's a signal that you are hearing. Respond to it. Father, I thank you for this time. Help us, Lord, to respond to you. The work that you've been doing in our hearts, Lord God. You've opened our ears today to hear the signal. Whether it's to get up and move in a place that is toxic, unhealthy, that is not good for us, or aligned with our calling. Whether it's to leave a relationship that is toxic, unhealthy, that is not in line with our calling. Or whether it's to leave something that we are doing, a habit that we are constantly doing, a lifestyle that we are constantly living that is not healthy for our lives. God, we hear the signal today. Give us the strength to respond. We pray all this in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Colin, for the message on this morning. It's a good message, one to really think about. Now is the time to give. Giving is a part of our worship service, but it's something that God requires us to do. He's given us so much, and he only asks for a small percentage back. And so at this time, you can use the QR code on the screen, or there are boxes in the back where you can give. If you don't mind standing. Okay. Let's pray for the giving. Father God,